The Grind is sponsored by a generous contribution from Adam Greenberg. Adam is a 2-term National Service alum of AmeriCorps, an Obama White House intern, and this coming spring, a Peace Corps volunteer. And he's here. Hey, Adam.
Hey, Mark.
So, Adam, what do you want to talk to our listeners about today?
AmeriCorps. AmeriCorps members get things done. Everything from rebuilding homes with Habitat for Humanity to tutoring and mentoring in our nation's public schools. Right now, 2,000 AmeriCorps members are deployed across the country, helping many families devastated after these most recent hurricanes and wildfires. The work is not always easy, but it is rewarding.
So, Adam, why is this important to you?
Mark, my AmeriCorps service set me off on an incredible path. I served 2 terms with AmeriCorps NCCC, the National Civilian Community Corps. Casually, you could consider AmeriCorps NCCC to be a cross-country national service road trip. It's an amazing year. I'm 31 now, and I'm grateful that I can look back on my 20s and say that they were a debt-free decade, traveling with intention through work with meaning. It's time we make it possible for more young people to be able to say the same.
So how can our listeners learn more?
You can find out more about AmeriCorps NCCC and other national service efforts at nationalservice.gov.
Hello and welcome to The Grind, everybody. Real talk to help you navigate the modern working world. I'm your host, Marc Casali.
I'm the producer, Warren Langford.
All right, Warren, where did we leave off?
Oh, last week, Will, we were talking with a student named Yusuf who he'd landed a few pretty good job interviews.
Right. And we weren't sure if he was going to make it to the second round yet. Yusuf, what's up, man?
Hey, I killed it, man.
You killed it?
I killed it. Hey, the first one, Liberty Mutual, I killed it so good. She was like, we want to have you for the second round, like, instantly. She was like, you need to interview with some managers. We're 2 managers. I was like, 1 is not enough, I need 2.
So Yusuf had landed some first round interviews. He was going to his second rounds.
He's got a good attitude.
Struggling a little bit, though. So all this was on my mind. I was thinking about Yusuf. I was thinking about interviews. I opened up the New York Times, and I saw this headline: "The Utter Uselessness of Job Interviews" by Jason Dana.
That's quite the headline.
Quite the headline. Caught my attention. And I think the reason why is that it put words to something that I've kind of felt for a while, which is that interviews, they don't do what they're supposed to do.
Yeah. I mean, somehow I've gotten every single job I've been interviewed for.
So they must be useless.
If I've gotten an interview, I am hired. That has been a constant in my entire life.
Wow. I think I'm like 30%. I'm better on paper, frankly.
You probably applied for a lot more jobs than
I'm better on paper.
So, but you saw this headline. It sparked something inside of you. You related to it, and
Well, but no, here's the thing. Here's where I wanted to go with this, okay? If interviews are so useless, why does every company use them? I don't know, okay? So I decided to call Jason and ask him how he knew interviews were useless and why so many companies still use them.
There's long been work in industrial organizational psychology showing that interviews aren't particularly good at predicting job outcomes. And particularly, interviews aren't very good when they're sort of unstructured and psychological, like when we just chat and I try to holistically figure you out, right? See what kind of person you are and figure out whether you'd be good at the job. But there's also a long tradition of research showing that hiring managers really think they are very good. So I guess what we're trying to understand is some of the behavioral factors behind that, right? So why would an unstructured interview be problematic, but yet why would you come out of it feeling like you know something? Here's how we investigated these things in the context of the interview. We're working with undergrad students as our subject population, so we let them interview people about something they know about, which is predicting someone's GPA for a given semester. So another student comes in, they get their course schedule for the semester in question, some background information, and really importantly, they get their GPA prior to the semester in question. But we also let them interview, let them do a 20-minute interview asking any questions they want as an aid in predicting. After they did their interviews, we also gave them the background information and the course schedule and the prior GPA for another person that they didn't meet and asked them to predict that person's semester GPA. And what we found is that they were actually predicting better when they didn't do the interview. So the person they didn't meet, they were able to predict their semester GPA better. And apparently these things that are coming up in the interview are actually interfering and making predict even worse.
That's disturbing, to say the least, I think. So, especially as someone who gives a lot of interviews or has been through interviews.
And when you do an interview, you're not just going to ignore it.
You set up this really unfortunate dichotomy, which is that interviewers can't glean much or enough or anything at all. And in fact, your research says it's almost a negative predictor of information from interviews, unstructured interviews, and yet they believe that they're gathering really high quality information.
We found really two behavioral factors of interest in our studies. One of them I'll call dilution. Dilution is just this idea that irrelevant information, stuff that's not really useful, instead of being ignored, actually drowns out the impact of valid information, actually lessens the impact of valid information.
Okay, so it's like there really is such a thing as too much TMI.
No, too much TMI is like too much information. Doesn't make any sense.
No. What I mean is interviewers actually leave the interview with less information about a person than they did going into it.
That's dilution.
I mean, if we were perfectly rational or we were computers or something, this wouldn't be true. More information could never hurt. But apparently we're not. The second factor we identified was something called sense making. And this is the idea, the idea that people can confidently turn virtually anything into a coherent narrative, even if it's nonsense.
Okay, so we have sense-making and dilution, and those are really the two mechanisms behind this effect that Jason's seeing. So to help myself understand it, and Warren, I hope this doesn't put you on the spot, but I actually thought back to our first interactions when we were, I don't know, interviewing each other to see if we wanted to work together on the podcast.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's okay. Don't get nervous. Okay, so right when we started talking, you emailed me a link to Personal Effects, which is your other podcast. And why don't you want to plug it? Just plug it now, Warren.
Go check out www.personaleffectspodcast.com. Great stories about objects and things.
It's an awesome show. So you emailed me the link. I listened to the show. It was a podcast that you made. It sounded great. That was like a really strong signal. That was a critical piece of data that proved to me that you could do a podcast.
What did I do in the interview that was like, red flags? This guy might not be a guy who could do a podcast.
Yeah, well, the rest of the interview was like, no, I'm kidding. But the point is, Warren, if I had asked you a bunch of like other unstructured questions, like what's your theory about interviewing, or what are your chops on Adobe Audition, or which podcasting hosting service is the most reasonable?
Right. I mean, I have answers set up for all of those, but are they honest? Are you going to get spontaneous, real answers when you ask those kinds of questions, or are you just going to get these set up answers?
And the point is, I actually already had the data I needed. I had Personal Effects. So even if you had answered those questions in whatever way, that other information would have diluted the effect of Personal Effect, and I could have made the effect of Personal Effect. I like that. That information would have actually diluted the impact of Personal Effect, and I could have made a worse decision. I could have told myself a story about maybe he doesn't really know enough about the nuts and bolts of podcasting production. I would have used my sense making, and I would have made a terrible decision, Warren, because you're the best thing that ever happened to me, bro.
10 minutes after this, we exchanged wedding vows.
And a podcast was born.
Okay, Mark, but I have to ask, since this is basically what your job is, what you've been studying, doesn't this kind of flip your world upside down?
Yeah, that calls into question not only every hiring decision that I've made, but like every hiring decision that has been made. It's almost too much to process.
What I'm telling you is kind of terrifying, right? Like
Yeah.
we have narratives that help us navigate our whole life. We have, we have stories we tell about all sorts of people. And the idea that we'd be this bad at it, right? That we'd be doing this even if behavior was sort of random is kind of unsettling.
All right, look, but I'm feeling kind of depressed right now. So far, Jason has just taught us that interviews are worthless, useless, don't make any sense. We got to leave the people with some tips here for how to make them better.
Yeah, especially because we've got to start hiring some people ourselves.
I knew I was forgetting something, man. It's on my to-do. It's actually on the board right there. Hire interns. Okay. How are we going to do better than the average person? Let's let Jason tell us. I know we're asking an abstract question here, but what are like the types of questions in an interview that you think would be better predictors based on your work, and which ones sort of fit this title of utterly useless?
Yeah, well, again, this will depend on what you're trying to accomplish with the interview. I mean, are you trying to suss out whether the candidate has skills? Then I think you want to have a lot of purpose in writing your questions in such a way that they're gonna, evidence those skills, right? If you want to talk to people to see if they're going to be a cultural fit, then you might schedule your interview more open and try to ask questions in a way that are going to, let people get on with you or show you whether they fit.
This cultural fit thing is super interesting because I've used that word a ton. It's come up a lot in conversations I've had. But what does it even mean? It just seems like a trap for biases, right? I mean, like cultural fit, like what, does that just mean, do I like you? Like, do I see in you someone that fits the company that I have today? It's a scary kind of nebulous word that I feel like we should all kind of, find our way away from, What do you think?
Possibly. I mean, companies should have missions and virtues and such. And maybe you want people whose virtues match that. They're going to fit the culture better in terms of not only getting along with people, but just thriving in the position and liking what they do and being effective. I could believe that. But what I find it harder to believe is that you're going to accurately assess that in this weird one-off situation of a job interview. And maybe even less so if you're being gotcha about it. So I mean,
and unstructured about it. I mean, I think that's like your key thing. So my wife works at Amazon, and they have 12 leadership principles that are like their religion there, right? And they are super focused on those. And actually they make a ton of business decisions and almost all their hiring decisions based on those principles. And they have very specific questions tailored to those principles, and they ask about each of them in the interview. To me, that's great, actually. I mean, that's like, I know this behavior is a key predictor of success at my company, and I'm going to ask the same types of questions across the board. That to me is different than trying to get a feel for if you're a cool person and then calling that cultural fit and making an assumption based on that, right?
Sure. If you're that principled, what the interview has to do, if it's a selection, mechanism, it has to honor those principles. But again, principles are great as drivers, but it's not always super easy to measure these things in a person.
We talked about if we're stuck doing interviews, we need to make them map to the job itself. We need to try to give more skill-based questions. I come from an environment where we do all case interviews, so I feel like those are better than just straight personality questions. We need to ask the same types of questions to each of our candidates so we can make a fair assessment. But let's put the interview like away for a second. In your case, you had GPA as a good indicator of success. If we're interviewing for a job, I mean, let's just brainstorm. I mean, what are other data points that we could use totally separate from an interview that we might discount today, but we should be paying more attention to?
So one thing that I keep, at least anecdotally, hearing that is on the rise is the kind of skills assessment use of an interview.
Yep.
So I might give people a little homework assignment. So my brother worked in insurance claims, and he said his favorite quote unquote interview was just being handed a sanitized claim form and being told, okay, tell me what you do with this, process this. Just having you simulate work or job skills, see them in action.
It's going to be a much closer simulation, right, than you answering questions about, tell me a time you've worked well in a team. I guarantee you I'll never ask you that question ever again if we actually work together, right? So I guess the overall lesson here is be purposeful about the questions you're asking or the way that you're going to assess, and make it mirror the actual work as close as possible, right?
Sure, if you can.
And I'm just thinking like references, maybe. I mean, that's a pretty real, like if I actually get someone on the phone who you've worked with and I get a candid answer out of them, that's going to be a really good indication, right?
That's tough though, right? Because it's hard to get candid references anymore these days, especially with legal environment. And a lot of people will just confirm that someone works somewhere.
Really? I didn't know that. So they don't give, they're afraid of litigation or something?
Hey, well, if I wanted to get rid of an employee, I might tell you they're great. Right? Yeah, take them. So this is always a problem.
Jason. Okay, yes, you're right. Okay, what about, and we said assignments, we like assignments if we can make them work.
I got a very interesting suggestion from a reader on this one. So sort of try to explain exactly what kind of work output they'd have to make. Ask them what things they've done like that before. And when people give you an example, then you say, okay, would you be willing to share that with me? Now, who's going to say no? Right? And now you've got that other thing.
So what if you're the interviewee? You know, I mean, I think we hope based on this podcast alone, and maybe based on New York Times, which has a slightly higher subscriber base than my podcast, that this will get out and interviewers will start changing their ways. But you're an interviewee now and you find yourself in this situation where you know you're being asked a bunch of unstructured, mercurial questions. What do you do? What can you do in that situation?
This is the hardest, right? And this is where I get the most speculative. Because, I mean, honestly, I haven't had much good to say about interviews. And so I think for a lot of people, they're just unfair, right? The terrifying thing as an interviewee is that you are facing a process that's sort of random. And I don't know, maybe that's a reason to feel good when things don't work out, right? Because
that's a great point.
It probably has much less to do with you than you really think.
That's a silver lining, Jason. Definitely.
It's a silver lining. And I've heard all sorts of speculation. I've heard from a lot of people after this article. But some people claim that they just try to capitalize on these things. So they recognize that that a person who really leans on this method, and especially when they have certain questions that they're in love with, it's a reflection of hubris, right? They've convinced themselves that they somehow do this better than everyone else, that they have some golden method of figuring people out. And you know what you're just looking to do there is to reflect that person, right? Because they're probably going to love that. And maybe even to ask them some questions and let them do a lot of talking, right?
Yeah. And I also wondered, could you take can you flip the script here as an interviewer? I mean, or interviewee, can you say, hey, I've loved this conversation, but I'm also super interested in your work. Can I do a little assignment to prove to you that I can get this done? I mean, that would be a pretty bold thing, I think, for a 22-year-old to propose, but I'd be impressed if someone did that for me.
Yeah. And in fact, I even got an email from somebody about the article who was doing this. He gave them a copy of the article and he said, I don't think a lot of interviews, but why don't you tell me? How can I assess you, right? How would I know whether you're good at doing this job? And got some interesting answers, I take it. But I think that's a fascinating approach to this. I mean, if you know that you have the skills and you want an opportunity to display them.
Yeah, and I think introducing more of, things that you think are stronger signals as well. So, I mean, we talk a lot about, it's different from the jobs that I was applying for when I was applying for them. But, now more students have their own, websites or portfolios that actually show off the work products they've produced in the past. And again, that's going to be a pretty decent indicator whether you can get the job done. So reference those, continue to point to things that are fact-based and hard to misinterpret, I guess, and I guess the prevailing thing here is if you feel like you're in an unstructured situation, you can still do your best to try to impose some sort of structure, introduce more facts, even if you're sort of fighting against the current of your interviewer, right?
Yeah, that's a great point.
All right, Jason. Well, I've really appreciated you taking the time today. Again, I think you're fighting the good fight here, and I hope that your article and research, get more press and continue to evolve, because we definitely need to have a hard think about what we're doing in these interviews. So I appreciate you, and thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me on. This is great.
All right, Mark. So we've got some hires to make here. How are we not going to screw this up? Following everything.
Wait, hold on. Email us at contact@thegrindpodcast.com to apply. Oh, that's good. Okay.
So we got to get these new interns in here. Got to teach them how to make podcasts. How are we not going to perpetuate the issues that Jason has just laid out for us here?
Okay, I got a few ideas. So I think the big thing that I took from Jason overall is try to make the hiring process resemble the actual job as closely as possible, right? That's the thing. Don't ask a bunch of behavioral questions if you're going to have someone sit in front of a computer and grind out Excel spreadsheets. Have them do an Excel spreadsheet. That's the fair test, right? I think if we got an intern that applied, we would actually give them some audio to cut. We would give them a raw interview and say, cut out the most interesting parts. I mean, rather than asking them, do you like podcasts or what's your work ethic like? I mean, those are just questions. They don't really resemble the actual work. The work is, can you edit a podcast down, right?
Yeah. But I'm also concerned that we might just be putting some of these kids who just don't know how to do this stuff in over their heads.
That's fair. Okay, so then at minimum, if we did have to ask some behavioral questions, because yes, it's asking a lot to expect a new intern to do a whole assignment on their own, we have to make sure those questions are exactly the same no matter who we ask. We can't give some interns softball questions and then some really hard gotcha. That is the epitome of an unstructured interview process.
All right, what else?
Well, we could look for other information, like maybe an interview is actually not a good way or not the only way that we should be assessing our candidates. Maybe they have portfolios, maybe they have written assignments, maybe they have something else that they've done that can help inform our decision. It shouldn't just be about an interview.
Right, like if someone has an essay they've done, building an essay is a lot like making a podcast. So we could relate that information and see how they've structured a story the same way we structure our shows.
Okay, good. So what if you're an interviewee and you find yourself in an unstructured environment? Warren, what do you do?
I think you gotta flip the script.
Ooh, I like it. Flip the script. Yeah. If you think there's some piece of information out there, like a writing assignment you've done or your portfolio that gives your interviewer a good indication of who you actually are, send it to them, okay? Don't let them dictate the whole process. You can be the principal agent in the interview process.
And we all know how much interviewers love being asked questions.
Yes, because they're going to like you more, but also, look, you're going to help prevent the dilution effect. If you introduce less information about yourself into the process, maybe that's some kind of judo trick to help short circuit dilution. That's an advanced move, but you guys are listeners to The Grind. You can pull it off.
All right, for this episode, we want to thank Jason Dana.
And if you want to read his article, which we would highly suggest, it's The Utter Uselessness of Job Interviews, and you can link to his research through that as well. As always, we have to thank Trackman Productions for our great music and PG Boo as well, PG Boo on Instagram. So I think we're done, Warren. What's our sign off for today? This just came to me. Grind now or forever hold your peace. Do you like that?